Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our afternoon session for day 2 of the Center for Racial Justice Summer Institute on the writings and legacies of Harry Chang, a forgotten theoretician of race. I'm just dropping some administrative information in the chat for you to look at: a registration link for tomorrow's sessions, morning and afternoon, and extra info on the Summer Institute on the CRJ's website. This afternoon session is called Theorizing Race after Harry Chang. It'll run for 2 hours and we'll wrap up around 3 p.m. In a minute, we'll hand over the time to our 3 speakers for today, Neil Gotanda, Linda Burnham, and Bob Wing. Once our speakers are done, we'll open up for discussion. You'll be able to unmute yourselves and speak. If possible, use the raise hand function so we can see who's trying to speak. Otherwise, we figured it out in the morning session, fine, so we'll figure it out in the afternoon session as well. And you can always put questions in the chat. We'll be looking at that. Okay, now I'm giving the floor to Christine Hong, Director of the CRJ. She'll introduce the session and our speakers.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second session of the day. It's this discussion, which features Linda Burnham, Neil Gotanda, and Bob Wing, addresses the many legacies of Harry Chang's intellectual and political work. And it also speaks to the enduring reach of his thought on both scholarly research and community activism and organizing alike. The speakers today will introduce their own work, and this spans the spectrum from critical race theory, racism in US politics, white supremacy, and they'll explain how Harry Chang's thought gave structure and direction to their own research and organizing trajectories. And we're going to begin with presentations, and the first presentation will be from Neil Gotanda. Neil Gotanda is Professor Emeritus at Western State College of Law. He is an original participant in the Conference on Critical Legal Studies, and he co-founded the Critical Race Theory Workshop. He co-edited the very important volume, Critical Race Theory, the Key Writings That Formed the Movement. And his other publications include a critique of our Constitution as colorblind, New Directions in Asian American Jurisprudence. And in 2008, he delivered the inaugural Neil Gotanda Lecture in Asian American Jurisprudence at UC Berkeley School of Law. The next person who will speak is Linda Burnham. Linda Burnham has been an activist, writer, and strategist focusing on women's rights and racial justice since the 60s. She co-edits and contributes to the 2022 book, Power Concedes Nothing: How Grassroots Organizing Wins Elections. Linda Burnham served as the National Research Director and Senior Advisor at the National Domestic Workers Alliance for nearly a decade. She co-authored, along with Nick Theodore, Home Economics: The Visible and Unregulated World of Domestic Work. This was the first national, empirically grounded study of domestic workers in the United States. Living in the Shadows: Latina Domestic Workers in the Texas-Mexico Border Region, which she co-authored with Lisa Moore, was published in 2018. Linda Burnham co-founded, along with Miriam Ching Louie, who is in the house right now, the Women of Color Resource Center. She served as the organization's ED for 18 years. In the 70s, Linda Burnham was a leader in the Third World Women's Alliance. Miriam Ching Louie was also part of this. Linda Burnham has published numerous articles on African-American women, African-American politics, and feminist theory in a wide range of periodicals and anthologies. For the past few decades, she's been a mentor to many leading social justice organizers and advocates. Currently, she's working on a book about domestic worker organizing and on Project 2050, an inquiry into strategic thinking on the left. Her writing and organizing are part of a lifelong exploration of the dynamic intersections of race, class, and gender in the context of US politics. And our last presenter, last but not least, is Bob Wing. He has been a social justice organizer, activist, and writer since 1968. He cut his teeth in the Third World Strike for Ethnic Studies at UC Berkeley. As a proud 1968er, Bob was part of the first wave of Asian American and people of color movements in the United States. We have reaped the benefits of this. Krez would not be here were it not for the efforts of people like Bob. In his over 50 years of activism, he's been involved in many intense and conscious efforts to theorize and build people of color and multiracial unity, as well as to connect issues of war, racism, sexism, and politics. He was the founding editor of the publication Color Lines, a national publication of race and organizing, as well as War Times. This is a bilingual newspaper opposed to the war in Iraq, which formed in the early War on Terror, Axis of Evil era. So I will hand things over to Neil.
Sorry, I was just turning off my email because it was dinging at me. Okay. I think this is the way I'm going to do it. I'm going to present off of my printed version and balance it on the screen in front of me. Okay. So first of all, of course, thank you to all of the organizers of the conference, everyone who's put in extraordinary effort. And as I was going through the participants, I wanted to say hello to many old friends that we haven't seen each other for a long time. And so it's a real pleasure. Today I'm presenting a short essay in 3 parts. An observation on the importance of Harry Chang to my work, a short note on how to talk about critical race theory, and then third, very much continuing in the spirit that Paul, of Paul's presentation this morning, an analysis of the Asian American racial category, and a little postscript on the coming Cold War with China. So first about Harry Chang and me. The longer I worked on this essay, the more I came to appreciate that virtually all of my intellectual life had been shaped by Harry and the time that I studied with him. So by the time we met Harry in the Bay Area, my then wife, Pat Sumi, who, as an aside, taught the first Asian Americans women's course at UC Santa Cruz way back when, but we were both already committed activists. And so going into an academic track was very much the product of my work with Harry. It was that work that led me to pursue an academic career, has guided my work on race and Asian Americans. So in 1979, after graduating practicing law at the Asian Law Caucus and several state agencies, I went back to get my LLM and become a law professor. And my LLM paper was The Origins of Racial Categorization in Colonial Virginia, 1619 to 1705. If that sounds like Harry's work from what Paul described this morning, it was. It was very much an academic and a heavily researched version of Harry's work. So as I said, I cannot, again, in reflection, begin to understate how much of an influence he was upon me personally as well as politically. And then my comments today are going to be primarily about racial formation, but that's only a part of the Marxist framing that I learned from Harry. I have used other parts of his work in other parts of my papers, and it's been very much an important influence. So before I turn to what I'll call applied Harry Chang light, I want to add an aside about critical race theory. So the way I'm talking about critical race theory now is that there are three principal ways that the term critical race theory is used. First is the older academic tradition, of which I was an active and very enthusiastic participant, begun in legal studies with Derek Bell and in the Conference on Critical Legal Studies. It was primarily academic until fairly recently. So, and fairly recently, it was picked up as an attack point by various conservative think tanks and intellectuals. So in the past few years then, as far as traditional academic critical race theory, the African American Public Forum and the Critical Race Studies program at UCLA have been a major part and repository for developing these ideas. They, although their work was not necessarily directly political initially or in the early years or for decades, they have now become a major part of the political response to the attacks on critical race theory. So the second usage of critical race theory are those attacks. So the way I would describe it is Fox News, Republican Party, dog whistle, anti-Blackness critical race theory. So it's a mouthful, of course, but trying to capture the sense that this is an across-the-board attack using the term critical race theory. These are attacks, sustained attacks claiming every possible discontent about race in America is the fault of critical race theory. While the main ideological theme of this usage is aimed at Black consciousness, I'll shorthand it to dog whistle CRT. So that's my current label for these attacks. It's dog whistle CRT is just an easy label. So what's important in terms of content to appreciate is that this second strand shares the name critical race theory, but relatively little else substantively with the other critical race theories. The third usage, which has crept into general mainstream news and commentary, is to use critical race theory as a general reference to Black consciousness, not necessarily adopting an attack mode, but simply in passing. So in these various forms, dog whistle CRT has been the vehicle for the continued attacks primarily on the content of our educational system. So it's important not to be distracted by this supposed content. Dog whistle CRT is not a collection of real ideas, but is instead an ideological assault on Black consciousness. It is not a serious critique or even a criticism. Dog whistle CRT is political theater and dishonest claims dressed up in pseudo-intellectualism, a sidebar claim in the spirit of Trump and Trumpist politics. So to respond in terms of examining a response to those attacks, I highly recommend the work of the African American Public Forum. It's available online. If you do a search on aapf.org, aapf.org, their website will come up, and it contains a wealth of information and resources for addressing the continued attacks of dog whistle CRT. So given that, that's sort of an explanation of why I am not directly addressing critical race theory. I regard my work and what I'm about to present as within that the intellectual spirit of critical race theory, but I make no claims to any kind of direct intellectual doctrinal links to this work and general traditional critical race theory. So let's return to Harry Chang and how he directly shaped my work on race and Asian Americans. So this section I entitled Violence and Racial Formation of the Asian American Category. So there are many ways to interrogate the Asian American. From Harry, we will use his crucial notion discussed by Bob Wing in his article, as well as Paul and Eric's articles, um, 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 to use the idea of racial formation. Now, it is now a cliche to say that race is socially constructed, which is a version and variation of racial formation. Harry's significant contribution, one of his significant contributions, is that a key analytic entry into racial formation is the racial category. Second aspect, second dimension that I want to emphasize is the notion of reification, that the social relations of subordination are reified and turned into a thing, the racial category. So my version of Harry Chang Light is the social relations of subordination are reified into a racial category and reinscribed onto race bodies. Okay. If your reaction is, huh, that's appropriate. So to illustrate what I'm trying to say, I propose I'm going to offer a case study, the Asian American racial category. Now, the Black category, as Paul described this morning from Harry's original work, is part of a deep historical genealogy in American social life and politics, going back to the 1600s and the origins of slavery in the United States. Our story, the Asian American racial category, is much more modern, beginning sometime arguably in the 19th century, in the 1800s, around Chinese, more or less. So to interrogate this case study, the question I'm going to ask is, how do you know you're an Asian American? This is first cousin to the question that I had to confront in my work on Asian Americans. Are Chinese a race? And you can substitute every other ethnic and national group from East Asia, South Asia, West Asia. Are you a race? So in order to interrogate this, I came up with my Harry Chang Light version in my Asian American jurisprudence work to ask, is it racial? And I offered 3 parts to a test, 3 things to look at. First, is there a racial category? Second, is there a color, race, or body type? And third, is there a mode of subordination? Okay, so racial category, body type, mode of subordination, 3 dimensions. And my suggestion was, well, if all 3 are more or less present, then you're much closer to it being racial and a racial category. So I'm offering, therefore, I'm a law professor, or used to be, a hypothetical example. So I'm walking along down the street. Someone comes up behind me and hits me over the head with a stick and says, "Goddamn blank." Okay, so that's my situation. And the query I'm asking, wait, is this an Asian American? Is this racial? Is it something to do with Asian Americans? Now, first question is, what would be the epithet? Right? Somebody comes up, hits me on the head, and says, "Goddamn." Now, if I were Black, the answer is easy. We all know what the word is going to be. It's the N-word. Right? Now, why is it so easy? Right? It's because in American culture and the Black-white paradigm, we have completely absorbed the Black category, the Black body, and a vocabulary of subordination linked to violence against Black bodies. We all already know what the racial epithet is going to be. It's not so clear for Asian Americans. So let's go through the 3 parts of my 3-part test for my body as I am being in this hypothetical. First, as far as the racial category, maybe it's Asian American, but if you ask me in these identity discussions, I claim identity as a Japanese American Buddhist, which sort of does, maybe it fits, maybe it doesn't, but so we have a sort of partial version in my first part of my test as to whether or not there's a racial category. Part 2 is color, race, or body type. Now here the answer is more clearly yes. The attacker recognized me as either yellow or an Asiatic body of some kind, and he had to, because otherwise he wouldn't know who to attack. I mean, sort of like that's clearly the body type is critical, is crucial for this recognition. So that there it's present. For part 3, I suggest there are 2 linked modes of subordination. First and most important is personal violence against my body. Okay. Second is the social cultural racial epithet. But we don't have an epithet with the universality of the N-word. So how do we analyze this? Okay. My suggestion is that as far as part 3, subordination, there are multiple forms of subordination of Asiatic bodies. Historically, socially, we know these various items: segregation, employment discrimination, ascribed foreignness, various forms of group violence, the Japanese camps, sexualized violence, and individual personal violence. The best known example is the Vincent Chin case. So my suggestion from that array of possible of multiple forms of subordination, the most significant form of subordination applied to Asiatic bodies is violence. Both personal violence, my fear of walking down the street and the fact that I might could have violence inflicted upon me, and group violence. So the Sikh temple massacre, the Atlanta spa shootings, these are forms of group violence aimed at individual Asiatic bodies. So notice the collective social response. There has been, in many of these instances, a collective social response to link these varied events throughout the community through the commonality of violence and violent subordination in a community response. This is a key part, this kind of collective response and the idea of commonality is a key part in the formation of the Asian American racial category. So in racial formation, the subordinations, all these various forms, but especially I would argue today, violence, are reified into the Asian American category. So it is the violence that answers the question, am I an Asian American? After being hit over the head and called a racial epithet, I know that my personal answer is now, yes, I am an Asian American. And there have been, in the last year, a number of articles, you'll see these floating by, about what I am afraid of, how I became an Asian American. And the common theme that I suggest there is violence. That's the mode of subordination which is reified which is today being reified into the category. So the last 2 decades of violence against particular Asiatic body types have generated increased collective group identification as Asian American. Less discussed is that the central model for violence against racialized bodies is violence against Blacks. That is, violence against Black bodies has been normalized and seen as acceptable. In the Black-white paradigmatic worldview, such violence is then permissible against other body types, especially those identified as non-white. Now note in this particular presentation what is not present in terms of racial formation. There's nothing about Chinese culture, nothing about community institutions and churches, nothing there about that in my little shorthand presentation, collective community responses or personal actions and personal beliefs. Those aspects of what, loosely speaking, are ethnicity are obviously important, but not central to what is happening today in Asian American racial formation. So this interpretation on the level of abstract categories links together violence against Black bodies and violence against Asiatic bodies as part of the overall fabric of racial formation and reformation in America today. American social violence is in the framework of racial formation, provides the broad social matrix in which this takes place. All right, so that's the main part, and a little postscript, right? There's another consistent and continuing dimension to the normalization of violence against Asiatic bodies, which is the multiple continuing American military campaigns in Asia. So again, we're talking about domestic racial formation. The domestic paradigm for individual and group violence against Asiatic bodies is the incarceration during World War II of Japanese Americans in concentration camps. So the possibility of new concentration camps arose during the anti-Muslim campaigns again, after 9/11. The question of Chinese bodies has been a frequent theme since 1949 in the founding of the People's Republic. Last week's trip by Nancy Pelosi, the continuation and as a continuation of Obama's pivot to Asia, only reinforces the sense of gathering storm clouds. The international economic issues surrounding China and the US continue. As previews, note that military and diplomatic actions against Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan were the grounds for financial, social, and immigration sanctions against individuals for those countries within the US. Similar sanctions against Chinese might well be taken in the future. These sanctions will apply against Chinese in a racialized context, just as 9/11 gave rise to widespread personal violence against someone who looked like an Arab. So too, personal violence against someone who looks Chinese will likely continue to worsen. So I suggest a racialization framework. We need to self-reflect on the process of racial formation. How do we become Asian Americans? We must focus upon a primary mode of subordination violence as systemic and embedded within the fabric of American society. And we must never forget that the essential nature of this violent racial fabric has been Black subordination. I do believe that Harry Chang's work can provide us with crucial guidelines in our intellectual investigations involving an Asian American racial category, and that interrogation must encompass violence aimed at Black bodies. Okay, now I'm done, Christine.
Thank you, Neil. Linda?
Hi, everybody. I apologize for the lighting. This is not a formal studio. Thank you, Christine, and others who put the time in to organize this reflection on Harry's contributions. I'm really glad to be able to do this and to have had the opportunity to think about the ways in which Harry influenced my life and my thinking. I also want to give a shout out to my friends, especially my friends there from the Third World Women's Alliance, who are in the house. So it's great to see you all. In this brief presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about the context in which I encountered Harry, and then how I encountered him, and what I think he contributed to my own intellectual development. And then I want to pivot and talk a little bit about the article that some of you may read. I'm not going to assume at all that you did read it, but I want to draw some links between Harry's theoretical work and how some of us continue to use the frameworks he provided us with to understand the politics of today. So first, I encountered Harry in the early 1970s, probably somewhere around 1971. I have my memory on here is going to be Miriam Ching Louis over there and Bob Wing. So they're going to correct all the mistakes that I make along the way. Vicky, you and Grace and Atieno, please do the same. So somewhere in the early 1970s Bay Area. And I want to draw a little bit about the context. I just arrived in San Francisco in 1969. But that period in the Bay Area, there's a lot of political ferment, the late 60s and into the early 70s. And that political ferment took the shape of course, ongoing anti-war organizing. So organizing related to the US war against Vietnam, of course, through the late 60s or mid to late 60s and into the 70s. It also included the energies, political energies coming off of the Third World Strike at San Francisco State and the Third World Strike at UC Berkeley, And this is important because it's, a time in which 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds are actually changing the academic shape of the nation. So what those strikes and others around the country did was make it possible for there to be a field of Black studies and Asian studies and Latino studies. When I went to school, I graduated in '68. There more or less was no such thing. If you wanted to know something about Black folks, you better go and figure it out more or less on your own. So just to say that 18 and 19 and 20 and 21-year-olds in that period were really impacting the political climate and the demands that they made in their in the political momentum that they had accumulated, created a lot of change. It was also a time, of course, in relationship to both the US war against Vietnam and in relationship to the anti-colonial struggles, particularly in various parts of the world, but particularly in Africa and Latin America, that those of us who were involved in those struggles began to develop a deeper understanding of US imperialism and its role in the world, the concept of international solidarity, and and then this also that intersected with burgeoning thinking and understanding and work around women of color feminism, and in the shape of the Third World Women's Alliance, and on the anti-imperialist side, the work of the Venceremos Brigade. It was also a time in which Angela Davis was arrested in 1970. So the strike at San Francisco State was somewhere around 68, 69, UC Berkeley, 69. Angela Davis is arrested in 1970. So for myself, this is, in other words, there's a lot of political ferment, and a lot of the folks who were active in one or another of these struggles intersected. They knew each other, they were friends, they were lovers, they were comrades, right? So it's a time of a lot of political ferment. I don't know Harry's whole trajectory in terms of how he intersected with this, but how I intersected with him is, as I say, I came to the Bay Area in '69. Some of my first political activism, thank you so much, Atieno Davis, was in a organization called Black Sisters United. And it was, Black sisters sitting down and trying to figure out, what do we have to say about feminism that might be different than what we're hearing? And so I was also very active in the campaign to free Angela Davis, our families had been close in Birmingham, Alabama, back in the 40s. So, and my sister was one of her attorneys. So I was very active in that campaign. There's a lot of ferment around getting Angela, bringing attention to what was going on with her in the Marin County Jail. So not surprisingly for all of these young folks active in struggle, there was an interest in Marxism and interest in theories of revolution. And particularly in the context of the Venceremos Brigade, it was for me, I went to college, I studied, I read, I knew something, but I hadn't ever engaged in kind of collective study. I knew pretty much nothing about US imperialism. I was an English major, so there was a lot I didn't know. I know how to read books, but there was a lot I didn't know. So in the context of the Venceremos Brigade, we had the opportunity to, sit down and study what's the US role in the world, what's the US role in Latin America, what's the US role in Cuba in particular. And so somewhere in the context of the Venceremos Brigade, I get introduced to Harry Chang. like I say, Miriam, Belvin, Bob, correct me if I'm wrong. And at some point, so I also in this period joined the Third World Women's Alliance, and at some point get recruited into these capital study groups. So I want to just say a couple words about what was, to me, extraordinary about the capital study groups that Harry, and what was extraordinary about him. So I didn't know anything about economics, like I said, English major here. So the notion that I could read and understand capital, the remarkable thing about Harry was no prejudgment. No prejudgment because you're a woman, no prejudgment because you're Black, no prejudgment because you're 22. No prejudgment at all about whether or not you could interact with complicated material and absorb it if the conditions were right. So, you know, anything from ground rent to the circuit of capital, if you sat around and talked about it for long enough, and let me just say, there was a lot of talk. If you sat around and talked about it for long enough, something might register, and that something might make a difference in your thinking. So I think, so that's a really empowering, I have to say, it's a really empowering thing that Harry did for us, which was to say, you can interact with some of the most complex and sophisticated economic and philosophical writings that are out there. If somebody gives you a path to do that, you actually can do that. He also introduced us to a rigor of thought that you could begin to develop. You're not going to turn into Karl Marx, but you could begin to develop similar rigor of thought, and that rigor had its place in left organizing. He introduced us to dialectical analysis. You know, none of us turned into well, maybe some of us did. I didn't. Turned into philosophers, but he felt like we could handle some of the basics of the distinction between the individual and the general. What is the unity of opposites? What's the interpenetration of opposites? What's materialism versus idealism? How do you understand contradiction? That we could struggle with that material and do something with it. So I'm just saying all this because Harry created extremely, for those who were prepared to do the work, he created an extremely deep and rich learning environment that I had never experienced before. And he was not interested in teaching us what to think particularly, but he was interested in helping us figure out how to think. So let's see. So I want to talk a little bit about race and racism and racial categories before I go on to this little piece I wrote. And some of this will replay some of what Carl talked about, and Paul talked about, and possibly some of what Neil talked about. But I just want to underscore again, now we're talking about the 1970s. We're not talking about now we're kind of post-critical race theory. So it's for us, or for me, it was a new idea that, first of all, that racial categories, that Black and white, let's just say for the moment, could be unpacked. That there was something behind those terms, that there was historical, I mean, you know that there's history, but that behind those categories themselves, there's an enormous amount of historical content, that not just that they're socially constructed, but that you can engage with the process of understanding the process of social construction, that it's there and available. and that that understanding then can really impact how you understand today. That what happened in the 17th century has something to do with how you understand, how you can frame what's going on in current politics. So, you know, so for me as a young person, having presumed Blackness, for having known something about slavery, but not much, the notion, for example, that of the relationship between the category Black or African and enslavement, and the fact that the first, this would not have been Harry's language at all, but that the first and base privilege of whites was exemption from enslavement. And that it is not that all Blacks are enslaved, but that Blacks are subject to enslavement. And then the tracing of how in law, I guess this is Neil's, I haven't read Neil's thesis, but I guess this has something to do with Neil's thesis. The tracing in law of how it comes to be that no, not indentured servitude, but lifetime enslavement. No, your children will not be free. And yes, this is a lifetime condition. And on the other side, both the exemption from slavery, but also the path from Christian or English or Irish to white and the substance of that category. So, so I want to say that you know, that stuff for me was revelatory, and I think I'm not sure that it's completely common knowledge to everybody now. Ought to be. We've been talking about it for a while, but just to say that for a young person, this was revelatory. Okay, I'm taking time, so I just want to just do a couple more things here, which is to say that the piece that I wrote when that I sent you, it's called No Plans to Abandon Our Freedom Dreams, or something like that, is completely informed by Harry. So, you know, Harry's writing mostly, Paul will have a word on this, and Bob too, because I haven't read as much of Harry's work as others have. But in my experience, his writing was not necessarily, and his thinking was not necessarily kind of focused on the politic of the day-to-day, but it definitely applies to the politic of the day-to-day. And so what I tried to do in this piece was to say, and the piece is in response to, I don't know if you all will recall, but in, you know, after Trump's election, there was just a round of hopeless commentary about why Hillary was defeated. And it was enraging, let's just say. And you know, it focused a lot on the white working class. And so what I tried to do in this piece, it went on and on and on about how the Democratic Party was enamored of identity politics, meaning that the Democratic Party was spending way too much time pandering to Black folks and Latinos and, you know, anybody of color, and way too little time on the white working class. And infuriating for all kinds of reasons. But I felt like it was an opportunity to bring back around the ways in which the national identity is hijacked by white folks, just to say. and that the real problem of US politics is not Black identity politics by a long shot, but the ways in which all too often, all too many white folks try to identify the nation with themselves, right, with whiteness. And to say in this piece that that MAGA and Trump are a high expression of this, and that what he has unleashed, what Trump has unleashed, is the way in which the development of white identity and the development of national identity, how those intersect and overlap. And also the ways in which having a Black president really ticked them off. There are many things that tick people off, but having a Black president representing the US of A unearthed some really atavistic and retrograde and reactionary and uber racist sentiments within a cross-class, it should be said, alliance of white folks. So I think Trump's victory is not fully comprehensible without a read on white identity, on what whiteness actually is, what whiteness represents, how it evolved, and how it functions today. White racial formation. And so I'm just going to close by saying that, Paul said at the end of his piece that Harry was optimistic about racism being overcome, and that within the working class that whites could be won to an anti-racist stance. That may be true. It's not true right now. And it is the task of us out here now to sort this out, to sort out the ways in which the white working class has I shouldn't talk about the class as a whole. So that's an extremely broad brush. You'll forgive me for that. But how large sectors of the white working class have thrown in their lot with the Donald Trumps of the world, at least in part because of fear of the immigrant, fear of Blackness, and it has to be said, deep patriarchal and Christian sentiments. So I just want to say that very last word, that Harry's, I would not for sure be the same person, and I think be able to do the work that I'm doing today without having sat for a very long time on Saturdays and Sundays for hours and hours trying to make our way through Capitol. I think we even took a stab at the Grindrsa for a moment or two. It was crazy, but it was truly formative. And so I'm happy to have had this opportunity to be in conversation with you all about that. I'm done.
Thank you, Linda. Bob?
Bob, you're still on mute.
You see, I'm a real pro with Zoom. I wanted to thank the Center for Racial Justice and led by Christine for putting on, I think this is the first ever public symposium about Harry's contributions. And I want to thank all of you for attending. I see so many old friends. So nice to see you, and I hope everybody is doing well. So I was radicalized in 1968 and 69 during the big fights, 10,000 National Guard every day for weeks on end at Berkeley, and the struggles at Berkeley, and of course that were happening throughout the world. There was Vietnam, but there was also France. It was just everywhere. It was Africa, it was Latin America. And I met Harry at the very end of 1970 when I was 19 years old. I had dropped out of school to make the revolution and had really not much idea what that meant. I worked closely with Harry from 71 to 77. Before studying with Harry, my idea of learning was pretty much limited to memorizing ideas or facts. I really didn't know what it meant to learn. I had no interest in reading, really, didn't know how to read critically or to really learn, let alone analyze. But I did have a lot of revolutionary rhetoric at the time. From Harry, I learned that that's pretty much what Linda said. I learned that Marxism, and especially, and Neil said, that Marxism and especially dialectics involves enormous rigor and specificity, not just formulas. To say a relationship is dialectical is to say almost nothing, because the real question is, what precisely are the dialectics of any given social relationship? Not just that they're dialectical, what are the dialectics? And how any particular social relationship interacts with other relationships in any given historical period, all eventually, at least, with the aim of figuring out how to make social change. It was mind-boggling. I wasn't going to go too much into this, especially since Linda and Neil painted the picture of that period so well. But I remember one mind-boggling, and there were so many mind-boggling moments with Harry for me. So just many, practically every week in those years. But one, I'll just say, I remember, Harry's, one of his signal contributions, as Neil and Linda said, was the critique of racial categories and how they were socially constructed. And, I had never thought about it. I thought that, you take the words of everyday life as if they existed forever. You don't interrogate these social categories of everyday life. You just take them as natural. And of course, it's especially easy to take race as natural because it apparently seems to be connected to skin color, to biology alone. So I remember Harry does this critique of racial categories and shows how they're socially constructed. And then none of us had actually done the history reading yet. After he makes some of these theoretical breakthroughs, we put together this, what we call it, the Racism Research Project. And we look into 17th century Virginia, and lo and behold, as Linda said, right there in the law books of 17th century Virginia, we see English, European, white folks, etc., trying to struggle with racial categories. At first, a Black person is a non-English person, but of course, that didn't work as a category to pick them out because there were a lot of non-English, and then people would acculturate to being English after a time. And then it became religious. Black people were non-Christians. And then lo and behold, about 1682, right on time with the development of the first origins of mass slave production, they come up with Black as a racial category that cements the possibility of permanent enslavement for a significant group of people. That blew my mind, that this thing could be theorized, and then blam, it was right there in the history books and the law books. Anyway, Harry made a lot of contributions to the Marxist method, to understanding capitalism, especially at a time when there was a raging debate over whether the Soviet Union was capitalist, and to the issue of underdevelopment. But his main focus really was on learning the Marxist method and applying it to racism. Similar to Marx's study of capitalism, Harry focused on the analysis of the system of racism, not so much about the state or the strategy to defeat racism. For most of my life, I have tried in close collaboration with Linda and many other of you on this call and many others to trying to extend Harry's analysis of racism into an analysis of the state and of social justice political strategy. And that's mainly what I'm going to talk about now. I did, for those of you who haven't seen it, I did write an article back in 2005 in the Monthly Review talking about what Harry's contributions were. And if you, I mean, Neil and Linda have already talked a lot about that. If you want to see more, you could read that article. But here I'm going to focus mainly on the extension of Harry's analysis into politics, basically. So the first point is to just explicitly say, which was certainly implied by Harry, but never said and never made a big deal with, the US state is a racist state from day one. From day one. Harry showed that racism and capitalism shaped each other in the US and how they were inseparable. Today we call that racial capitalism. Back then, that understanding wasn't there, let alone a term to put on it. This is also true of the US state. Racism shaped the state and the state shaped racism. And really, in a certain way, that is one of the core ideas of critical race theory. And you could say this is really what, you know, Harry could be seen as a forerunner of both racial formation and understanding the relationship of racism and capitalism and of critical race theory. So the US was actually the only successful modern independence struggle that was led by slaveholders. This was not true in Cuba or Brazil or any of the other countries that were slaveholding countries. And therefore, they went about creating the state that they wanted. They were the leading part of the revolutionary coalition. From the American Revolution to the Civil War, as a result, the number of slaves multiplied ×4. And the US expanded its settler colonialism, genocidal power over native peoples from the East Coast all the way across the continent. An explosion of anti-Black, anti-Native peoples came on the heels of the American Revolution. Makes it hard to celebrate the 4th of July, especially when the Brits abolished slavery in 1833. With the exception of a short hiatus after the Civil War, the US was a white settler racist dictatorship until the Civil Rights Revolution of the 1960s. People of color had no rights. They had no voting power. It was a dictatorship, a term that's rarely used to describe it. And in addition, the ruling alliance, every state is not just the state of the ruling class, it's a state led by a ruling class, but who tries to build a united front around it. And the main form that united front takes is incorporating different forces into the state and in leading positions in the economy and society. Well, in the United States, the ruling alliance was fundamentally white slaveholders originally, then white capitalist slaveholders, then white capitalists with large sectors of the white population. Historically, the key ruling alliance has been the majority of white people who have so far been willing to actively increase and defend the multitude of white political, economic, social, and ideological privileges at the expense of people of color. Today, for example, even today, after all these years, a household headed by a white high school dropout has twice the net wealth of a Black household headed by a college graduate. Here we are all these years later and all the talk about the great American democracy. Anyway, many white people oppose racism and have from the beginning, but many non-capitalist white people are an active racist force, as we saw in the Chinese exclusion movement, and today, many times, but today most vividly in MAGA. White people, including white working class people, are key contested political terrain. Moving to the liberal racist state. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were historic victories that formally eliminated the white political and social dictatorship. However, as with Reconstruction, the anti-racist forces lacked the power to truly implement these revolutionary changes. At the time, people of color were only about 13% of the population and could not rally enough white people to defeat the vicious counterattack mounted by the racist forces in the wake of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. Indeed, this was the origins of what is today the MAGA movement. That started right then. The fundamental strategy of MAGA began then. It's gone through changes and got more and more radical, but that it literally had continuity from that time. The racist Republicans dominated the government from Nixon's victory in 1968 under the rubric Law and Order until 2008. There was only one Democratic president, and he was a one-termer. And racial equality, as a result, inequality is as greater today than it was then. Moving on to the state and situation today. Since the year 2000, the election of 2000, the liberal racist state has been increasingly under siege, both from the left and the right. On the right, the Republicans, enraged by the Black president, as Linda said, the Black president, though representing the fact that people of color had become an immense part of the population and started to represent an actual political threat to their rule. They have moved now to straight up white authoritarianism because they realize that democracy will not do it for them. They can't win in a real democracy. And they've, under the banner of Make America Great Again. On the left, the number and the remarkable electoral unity of peoples of color, now 42% of the population compared to 13% in 1965, together with increasing number of white progressives, are demanding an end to systemic racism. Polarization. The country is experiencing its greatest polarization since the Civil War, with huge historic stakes for the people and the planet. The structure of white minority rule. After dominating the presidency and the country since Nixon's victory in 1968 till 1980, till 2000, the GOP has only won a majority of the presidential vote once since the year 2000. They have only won the darn thing in 2004, and by a slim margin. This outcome, the blatant fact that we do not have a country with one person, one vote, that we have an extremely flawed democracy, has exposed to the light of day the extent of the structure of white minority rule, even within the liberal state. So now I'm going to talk about some of the elements of this structure of white minority rule, starting with the Electoral College. The Electoral College is a key pillar of white minority rule. It was invented to ensure slaveholder rule originally. First, they came up with the idea of counting slaves as 3/5 of a person. You remember this? But a lot of people forget that that rule only applied to counting population for the purposes of deciding how many Congress people a state would have. The rest of the Constitution didn't uphold that slaves were human at all. But by counting slaves as 3/5 of a person, the slaveholders were able to dominate the Congress. Then they came up with the idea of the Electoral College, which works by, you have a number of electors. The election is done by the Electoral College. In the Electoral College, you have electors. Each state has electors depending on how many Congress people they have. So since they'd rigged with the 3/5 rule that they would have majorities in the Congress, with the Electoral College, they rigged that they would control the presidency. Today, the Electoral College disenfranchises somewhere in the vicinity of 40% of all Black voters. Here's how that works. About 56% of Black voters live in the South. But in almost all Southern states, the white voters outvote the Blacks and other Democrats, and therefore win all of the electoral votes for the most conservative side of the country, the Republicans, and today the MAGA people. Take Mississippi. Mississippi has the highest percentage of Black voters in the country, about 36%, about 90% of whom vote Democratic. But whites are 64%, and 90% of them vote MAGA Republican. So in every election, they outvote the Blacks in state after state in the South, with a few very important and growing exceptions, like Virginia, like Maryland, like Georgia, and thereby nullify the votes of millions of Black people, tilting the scales heavily in their direction. This is fundamentally why they've controlled the presidency while losing the popular vote. A second piece of the, well, the Electoral College, I won't go into this so much, but the Electoral College also gives tremendous power to small states. Like in Wyoming, Wyoming gets about 1 electoral vote for every 90,000 voters. In California, although we have a lot of electoral votes, we get about 1 electoral vote for every 400,000 voters. A huge weight to the small states, almost all of which are very conservative and Republican. There are other pieces, but I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip. There's the Supreme Court, obviously. There's the gerrymandering. The gerrymandering, for example, in North Carolina, the Democrats win the overall congressional vote in North Carolina, but because of gerrymandering, they only have 5 of the 13 representatives. Gerrymandering is so bad now with the Republicans at the helm that we actually have a better chance to win the Senate than the House in this election, despite all the inequities of the Senate. Finally, there's voter suppression, mass imprisonment, blocking the path to citizenship for immigrants. And by the way, there is nothing in the Constitution that restricts the right to vote to citizens. That is not in the Constitution and is changeable. And in fact, in the 19th century, large numbers of immigrants did in fact vote. But even these have not been enough for MAGA. Their drive for power is now utterly insatiable, and the recent reaction to the legal search of Trump's house, just now they're literally calling, many of them literally calling for war. We literally have been at war for quite a while, but it's been relatively peaceful. But obviously since January 6th, things have heated up to another notch. On the good side, progressive grassroots organizing has massively expanded in the last 20 years. And in 2020, for the first time since the 1930s and 40s, social and racial justice forces threw down completely in the electoral battles that determine who holds power in this country and made a major contribution to Trump's defeat. Politically significant grassroots groups are operating in the vast majority of states as well as nationally. They have pretty much united on an anti-racist, multiracial, working class point of view and are learning to operate inside and outside of the Democratic Party. I refer you to the book that Linda and others just edited, Power Concedes Nothing, which details and analyzes the work of many of these grassroots efforts. As MAGA's rapid response to the search of Trump's house shows, we are in a test of power. Winning the 2022 and 24 battles for votes and for who gets to count the votes is indispensable if we are to thwart MAGA. But electoral victories alone will not be sufficient. Education and crucial issues like climate change, abortion rights, action in the courts, etc., organization and mobilization in workplaces, schools, and communities are absolutely essential. We have to win. We have to win. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, all 3 of you. We wanted to open this up to discussion. There wasn't much time in our first session to have discussion. And so, if you wouldn't mind, I also, if you'd be willing to turn on your camera, Since this is a reunion of sorts, please feel free to do so. But, I guess, why don't I yield the floor? Do people have questions? I have tons, but I will restrain myself. Stefan, is there a question that you'd like to pose? Okay, there's a question from Rebecca.
Hi, yeah, thanks to everyone who just presented. My question is for Neil. I've been thinking a lot about these questions of racial identities and racial categories, and I think that your proposition that certain racial categories, or perhaps all racial categories, come from this framework of subordination and specifically violence. And I'm wondering if you think that that's a sustainable categorization and identity formation, and if that's ultimately going to produce sort of cycles of violence and trauma in the kin in generations to come, of people who have ancestors who experience that violence. Is there maybe, do you see sort of an avenue out of that type of identity formation into something more, I guess, positive rather than negative?
I think I'm the wrong person in terms of trying to understand the way I think you're looking at identity. In other words, the social, well, I'm just really antisocial. I'm not sort of like a really good person to talk to about building community, about how we can make our own lives better in terms of community. So I think your question about how we proceed is really important. I would ask of others, do they have their thoughts? People who've worked in community organizations and done work that perhaps could better address what I understand to be the question. Did I get it wrong?
Yeah, and just like in the spirit of a discussion, this is a relatively, small group of people, feel free to unmute yourselves and take part in the conversation. So if there's any, Linda or Bob, if you'd like to take this on, I know there are other people in the house. Rebecca, there are tons of people who have amazing experiences organizing, but are there other people who'd like to undertake this?
Yeah, and just to clarify, this was in relation to something that Neil had originally posed, but of course I'm very open to hearing from other organizers and activists, academics, etc.
My concern, all right, the concern I have had has been the Chinese, that is to say, the significant amounts of community organizing that have taken anti-Black turns, very complicated community politics and complex interactions, which I don't pretend to be able to address or facilitate in any way, but just aware of the difficulties and complexities of that kind of community organizing, and sort of I guess this, what I'm trying to do is to point out, this violence is coming, and to appreciate in some broader social context what's going on, and the interconnections with Christine is deeply concerned with anti-imperialism. What's going on in Asia is, in one perspective, inter-imperial rivalry. It's an ascendant China and and an American imperial sentiment which doesn't want to give anything up. So those sort of like broad stroke backgrounds And then, of course, it plays out at this individual and personal level. And so, you know, my work has been in these broad strokes area of fairly abstract analyses.
Rebecca, I'm not sure I completely understood your question, but I maybe have a couple of relevant observations. It was really helpful, Neil, to hear your analysis of Asian American identity formation, and I think it is also true, clearly, that Black identity is really also bound up with anti-Black violence over centuries. But if I heard your question correctly, and I may not have, I think it's also true on the African American side that there are also extremely kind of life affirming and positive and healing and non-traumatic elements of African American identity that have developed over time, and also complexities which goes back to Harry and the insistence of dialectics in general of change and motion. So for African Americans, there is the incorporation. My people are not out of African American slavery, they're out of Bayesian slavery, right? So there's always the incorporation into African American identity of folks who come from other parts of the world who have African ancestry, who have to actually figure out what does it mean to be African American in the United States. I heard one woman say, hey, I'm Haitian, I didn't come here to be Black twice. Well, unfortunately, that's what you're gonna be. So, but that takes time. It takes work to figure out if you're an immigrant from Nigeria, from African and Black majority population, what does it mean to be plopped down in this situation? So all of this is to say that as I was hearing your question, yes, there's the association with violence and anti-Black violence, and as Neil said, anti-Asian American violence. But there's also, you know, lots of kind of rich and creative and interesting developmental stuff going on with each of these identities over time. I have no idea if that was to the point, but.
I have a few observations. I think the Asian American issue is in process. It's in process. It always has. It never completely took hold. It took hold more among whites than it did among Asians, even back in the day, largely because Asian communities have largely been separated by ethnicity, not living together, with some, of course, exceptions, especially with Chinese and Filipinos. But fundamentally, what forged, in my opinion, an Asian American identity was Asian exclusion. There was a common history, because in 1965, there were only 1.2 million Asians, and they were really 99% or 95% Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino. And now we've had an enormous change in the Asian population with the 1965 Immigration Act, which finally deracialized immigration. There are now 20 million Asians in the country, and the overwhelming majority of them did not go through and have no family history of going through Asian exclusion. And so we're in a whole different ballpark, and the Asian ethnicities are not just from a few countries in East Asia plus the Philippines. It's now from enormous number of countries throughout East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and West Asia, many of whom don't necessarily even look much alike. So I think it's contested terrain. Asian American has, among other things, though, become an enormously important demographic category. And so most people will at least embrace it as a demographic category. But I think that with the current situation of anti-Asian violence, it is reinvoking Asian American identity as a potential progressive identity. And with the vote, Asians have actually moved in concert pretty much in moving from a largely Republican vote until the 1990s, until now, where they're pretty much like a 70% Democratic vote. So between the two, and really in reaction to the far right and the far right's anti-Asian violence, there's a re-invocation and reawakening of a potential progressive Asian American consciousness. But Asian American identity, largely because of the complex class composition of Asian Americans, can also be used as a reactionary identity, as we've seen with Asians who are positively opposed to affirmative action and other important anti-racist initiatives. When you get an Asian coalition that is dominated by the more affluent, propertied, high-tech folks, you have an explosive potential on the other side, which is significantly covered up right now, although it's certainly happening, but it hasn't exploded as much as it might have if it weren't for the emergence of Trump and MAGA. But I guess I think that, you know, we will have an ongoing conflict between the United States and China, which will certainly continue to regenerate a certain anti-Asian racism in the United States. But I'm not sure where all this is going.
Yeah, I'd like to return to that and to think about the reactionary potential and possibilities of this moment, especially around, you know, that very problematic rubric, anti-Asian hate, you know, and to think about some of that. But just to bracket that for the time being, I wanted to yield the floor to Dawn.
Thank you. I'm still on this theme. So my background is that I got into Asian American movement activities by trying to organize on the campus level. And one of the big things that changed from the 70s to now in terms of what's happening on college campuses in terms of organizing Asians and asserting Asian identity is that, as Bob's indicated, we've had an influx of so many different groups of Asians who come from different countries in Asia, which presents to me the biggest challenge of organizing the Asian American student population because of their very strong national identities that they bring to this country. So bringing it back to what one of Harry's concepts that I was unfamiliar with, which comes from Marx, he talked about the distinction between Gesellschaft and Gemeinschaft, and this was in relation to his critique of the Black Nation thesis. You know, the notion that Black people in this country may want to see themselves as you create some kind of national identity, but it's like nearly impossible to do that. But he used to talk about that in terms of Gemeinschaft when he would explain that Gemeinschaft was a mindset where it relates directly to national identity. It's like if you grow up in Korea or Vietnam, you understand first and foremost what it is to be Vietnamese or Korean. Then you come to this country and then you experience racism for the first time. And then you understand what it means to be Asian and not from your national origin. So in terms of organizing raising consciousness among Asian Americans around anti-racism, it's always been my view that you have to educate newly arrived Asian Americans historically about things like the Vincent Chin experience. And then, as it relates to current events, what happened in Atlanta is not about anti-Chinese or anti-people who are the source of COVID. It's anti-Asian hate. So I don't know. I just find that, and so, and then just to a lesser extent, I think what Linda's talking about, as you have larger influxes of Nigerians and West Indian Blacks and so on and so forth. I mean, to a lesser extent, they probably don't understand white racism, or they haven't experienced it viscerally until they come to this country. So in terms of organizing around anti-racism, and I think you just constantly have to bring it back to racism and Harry's racial categories, and how anti-people of color is basically a social construct. But then when you think about it in terms of imperialism, you have to find the commonality, and that's where it comes back to class. And so to me, that's kind of where the direction of, that I would hope people who are curious about critical race theory attempt to have the broader recognition. And this is really where Harry was so strong, in terms of he would constantly preach to you in these classes, in these capital classes, about recognizing the difference between the particular and the general. So all people of color, from whatever their particular color is a particularization of either race or of class. And he just constantly had, and it was through the teachings of Marx. It's all in the capital is a constant lesson in thinking in higher order levels. So anyway, that's my pitch.
Yeah, thank you. I'm reminded yesterday, Betsy Yoon of Nodutol was typing in the chat a comment about the urgency of thinking through responses to injustice, including violence, anti-Asian hate, that are not neoliberal and uncritically aligned with power, and I think that therein lies the potential in this thinking about anti-Asian hate as a rubric for a kind of reactionary response. Linda, I wanted to ask you, you stated in your piece at the end, you spoke about the urgency of being able to imagine what you call new forms of multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-gendered worker organizing. And I'm thinking about how in the reading that we had in the morning, one of Harry's readings, he speaks about how the real relations of racism were obfuscated. And he's talking about that particular historical moment, but it's true right now, because as your piece and Bob's piece demonstrate, MAGA politics is very much about the seizure of a minoritized rhetoric and array of grievances that we associate with historically marginalized people, right? So one of the, I'm just reminded here of, there was an interview that this New York Times journalist named Jake Caspian Kong conducted with the head of the Manhattan Institute, speaking about CRT. And some of you may have read this, but you know, the Manhattan Institute has been the lead organization that has these downloadable, like, hey, you know, like parents, go ahead and go to your local school district and, you know, criticize any kind of teaching of, you know, ethnic studies history as CRT, and here's a toolkit. And so he was interviewing this, the head of this institute, who's actually South Asian American. And what this, I forget what his name is, but the head of this institute stated that the goal in the current culture wars and the sort of deployment of this language of minority grievance on the part of, you know, as marked as white, like white minority politics, the goal was to capture working class communities of color. And by playing on working class communities of color's fears about crime and violence, and that this is a kind of another law and order moment. And I just wonder, it's not just that people on the left or progressives have to try to figure out or sort out how to come up with a sort of united front, to use Bob's terms. This is actively something that has been seized by the right in terms of this moment in order to construct a united front that is pro free enterprise, you know? And I just wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Okay, a lot of stuff just went by. I think, you know, the right has made it clear that it's really, 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 really good. I mean, they've got great messengers, and they're really, really good at turning left, what they perceive as left terminology or frameworks or whatever, turning those to their own, either turning them and using them against the left, or creating whole campaigns, whole organizing campaigns around them, as with CRT. So, and it is also true, and there's a memo from Kevin McCarthy on this, that the MAGA folk have and are implementing strategy and pouring resources as we speak into strategies that target, in particular, Latino and Black men. So search for the memo, you'll find it. So that's, I mean, that's happening right now. So they are actively trying to sort out how to fracture the fairly solid Black vote, and how to pull more Latino men to the side of the Republican Party. So, and you know, the other part of this conversation is that the left is not, we are extremely fragmented, and we do not have a coherent strategy. Has anybody noticed? And what is also true, though, as Bob mentioned, is that there are some folks, many folks, who have taken on the project of trying to sort out how do you start to undermine the influence of right-wing politic and the MAGA bloc in white working class communities. How do you knock on white doors and have hard conversations? And how do you how do you make that? I think somewhere also in that article, how do you make that the project not of an election cycle, but of many lifetimes? Because that's what it's going to take. So somehow folks kind of got complacent. I don't know, neoliberalism, they've all got it under control, at least whatever. Well, clearly they didn't. And the threat of fascism is very real, and the capacity of the left to get itself together in a tightened up time frame and meet that threat at the level that it's posed, it's not clear that we're there. So, and you know, all of this has to do with where we started, which is the difference it makes to have a coherent understanding and theory of race in this country. It makes a big difference in just reading the day-to-day. So I don't know if that answered the question, but that's what I have.
No, I mean, I appreciate that. Bob, did you want to add anything? Vicky.
Yes. Hi, everybody. I have a question. None of you have spoken anything about religion and its impact in the various racial groupings and in the election process. I am particularly concerned not only about the Black community, but also about the Latino community and the pull or the power of the church to sway people in those communities. Any comments from the panelists on that, please?
Can I speak a little bit? I just have a technical question. How do I, am I allowed to raise my hand, or are we in a separate category from? No, it's just, I just didn't know what the.
Oh, feel free to just unmute yourself and speak, you know,
okay.
if that's what you're saying.
Yeah,
yes.
I just missed something. Okay, so religion. First, in terms of categories of religion with regard to Asian Americans. I have an old article out there, The Racialization of Islam, about how the social treatment of religion, of social groups of Muslims has formed has characteristics of racialized treatment. So it's a social treatment formulation. Sahar Aziz, a professor, I think now at Rutgers, has a recent book, which is excellent, about a much more broader and comprehensive discussion about Islam, discrimination, gender, and race. She's not a Harry Changist, but she's a wonderful scholar. An observant scholar. So as far as non-white, non-traditional religion, I think we can use our past framings of race and racialization and racial categories in a productive fashion to understand how Muslims have been treated. Now, it's a very different question in terms of white evangelicals. And there's a rich, journalistic treatments about the dangers of this in, all the standard news journalists and our, Atlantic, Harper's, the sort of liberal journals about what's going on in terms of the character and nature of religion and white, specifically white racial evangelicals. Now, in terms of the Black community, I have not seen anything like the literature about white evangelicals, which tend to be either laudative or alarmist, sort of like one extreme or the other in terms of that literature. But I don't know. I have some old books lying around and sort of classic works about race and religion. subject with a subject position treating African Americans, but I'm not aware of more recent discussions and conversations. So I'll plead, I don't know on that front. But notice that what I'm doing is I'm dividing the religion up. Religion is to be treated both socially and as a group. It is its own social formation. Religion is not the same as other kinds of communities and groups, occupies a different place in our social setting. And I would be, it would be one of those things, Harry, what do you think about what's going on with regard to religion? Would be one of those questions that I would be absolutely wonderful to be able to ask him. And he's not with us, unfortunately. So those are, they're not a response, but I think that some of the framing of how we treat them can be very different. Harry's work offers insights into certain dimensions, but not necessarily to others. I had another set of thoughts about another related set of considerations. Let me pause here for religion. Vicky's query. Others?
Don, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, so I'm a lawyer, and so I follow what's happening in the Supreme Court a lot, and this kind of ties what Linda was talking about. And if I understand your question, Vicky, if you're talking about how America can be more inclusive and respectful of all religions, not just one religion, what you want to focus on is the extent to which the Supreme Court is attempting to, it's a MAGA thing, is trying to equate Christianity with whiteness and trying to pave the way for the establishment of Christianity as the predominant religion in this country. And to Linda's point about the attacks on the left, or the lack of strategic responses by the left, I think most of the people on this call are from the academic community, and so I'm sure most of you are already familiar with Turning Point USA, but it's this quote unquote nonprofit organization by right-wing people that started for the purpose of calling out anybody who appeared to be a leftist professor. And I just Googled Turning Point last night, and I realized there's a little bit of history there, but Ginny Thomas is like very, very closely involved with Turning Point USA. And, she was involved in trying to overthrow the results of the election. But that she and her husband, Clarence Thomas, are all about establishing Christianity as the primary religion in this country. And it's because it's tied to the anti people of color movement that the right is mounting against us. That's all I have.
There's also the organization Campus Reform, which is really active in trying to police what gets taught on campuses and who gets to teach it. Atieno?
Thank you so much. Like for today, this opportunity to get more insight into like the work of Harry Chang. Had a very brief chance to attend a couple of those capital classes, and I couldn't understand the damn thing, okay? However, I do come to understand it over time, and just am amazed, and I've said this earlier, but I'm amazed at how it moves on to become what I see as a very popular framework for understanding racism like today. I think the other thing about that work, Harry's work in that time period, were the role of the movement as a safe space, if you will. I come out of Boston, the 1950s, very, very, very heavily segregated. You did not go to certain areas. And if you did, you knew that you were in serious trouble. And that was just like a reality. And I actually went to Antioch, like also in in 69. Now the movement opened up a floodgate of like education. How did I get in? Antioch had to comply with federal like guidelines in order to continue to receive certain kinds of funding. So I'm one of 50 Black students in 1969 who are offered 4-year scholarships to this college. It's a very progressive campus for sure. There are many people who have gone through there, but we were a nexus of 50 Black students, many of us like basically grown up on the streets, such as myself. College was not something that we were looking like to do, but this is the impact of the movement, which says open up, open up, open up. And there weren't very many Asian students on that campus at that time. It's the movement that created what I'm going to refer to as safe spaces. And the role of these safe spaces as places in which there's cross-pollination, if you will. People are beginning like to talk, because again, that anti-colonial like movement, which over time like develops into anti-imperialist framework, the work of like the Cubans, people were beginning to able to come together, like to talk, to think, like to look at, to wonder, okay, to work with, moving outside of the segregated boxes, class and race, and also gender segregation, okay, like in the United States, because this is something that is actually very, very, very critical. The church at that time was playing a very different role. People remember like the work of Father Romero in the South, okay? I mean, people are doing some deep, like incredible kinds of like liberation theology. I remember, so there were many different ways in which people were actually looking, thinking, and wondering like together. And there was a lot like that was going on. One of the things about this period, and I know some of it is related to COVID, some of it is also like income like driven as well. So you see the driving out, the shutting down, the gentrification of like neighborhoods, the changing. Where are the safe spaces that actually encourage people to come together? We've talked about that, like the role of the barbershops and the churches, like at one time. They're not doing like that same thing. The Pentecostal like church, it creates a safe space, if you will, okay, for that Magna crew. And I want to just like emphasize, people need to recognize that in the African American like community, there's a strong Pentecostalist trend, okay, that has been anti-abortion, okay? In 2004, I saw one of the nephew or the nieces of Dr. King, who came to Boston on the eve of the city sponsoring that Democratic Party convention to present an anti-abortion like framework. They had a big, huge march right there. So there's many different, we also need to be careful. And when we talk about like communities and people, and just kind of recognize there's been big time major change. It's not the same. We cannot keep using definitions from basically the struggle against Jim Crow, like in segregation. It ain't that way. It don't work like that right now. And that's the significance. I'm hooking up with something that Bob said when he mentioned the fact that how the Asian American population has changed. It's not people who actually had to deal with that exclusion. How does that affect, okay, the framework then that we offer, or that we are hoping people will like begin to turn, create, generate for themselves? Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, it's so interesting. They may not have been generationally in terms of a family lineage impacted by exclusion, but exclusion sets up the gatekeeping state, and then so it arguably impacts us all. And then, I think too about the generations that came after the so-called liberalization, or as Bob says, the deracialization of immigration law. Many of them, are part of war-forged diasporas. And we're talking about imperialist war, US imperialist war. And so, it's true, like, the conditions do shift, but, how does our vocabulary shift? And I'm wondering, Atieno, you brought up such an interesting point, like, what if we thought about, the Marxism and racism, political study groups as a kind of space of coming together, of inquiry, and it's also safe. Like, some of what you're describing resonates with how Linda described the experience of being in those study groups. And I wonder too about the history then. Linda, you began by speaking about what students were doing in their 18, 19, 20-year-olds. Ethnic studies is the only field, I think we can say, that emerges and gets formalized and institutionalized within institutions of higher learning, but explicitly from the outset had a critique of the university, right? And
Yeah.
so, like, there's something interesting about, and I read, I was rereading Miriam Ching Louie's amazing essay, which we included as recommended reading, and Miriam writes about how, during that third world strikes in the Bay Area, that basically the students that were active, they did so many different things. They had to confront state power in the form of the National Guard and the form of a tactical unit of the SFPD, and that their grades lapsed, they took incompletes, and that in the end, and I'm reading here, strikers compromised and accepted an ethnic studies division. And so even though ethnic studies is sort of lumped with CRT and all of it is under assault right now in this sort of current culture war, I think it's really important that we think about what is ethnic studies and what should we be fighting for? Because the way that racial formation gets understood is not dialectically. I think that's what gets lost. Harry's insight about understanding racial formation dialectically gets lost, and instead racial formation comes to denote what we might pejoratively call the four food groups. And the four food groups get crystallized. And then what happens is that, like if you see like what happened in California in terms of the ethnic studies model curriculum, basically white nationalists as well as Zionists see any mention of Palestine in the ethnic studies model curriculum as incredibly threatening, and just the entire ethnic studies framework is threatening. And what ends up happening is that because there is this adherence to the sort of original four groups, so that, like if we take what Miriam is saying, that there's a compromise and ethnic studies is formed, and that's not necessarily synonymous with the animating politics, right? What ends up happening is you have a kind of institutionalized model of ethnic studies that gets defended almost in originalist fashion, like, were you part of the original food groups or not? That way, you could be admitted into ethnic studies or not. And then that's the way that actually, it's almost like ethnic studies becomes misunderstood, and mobilized as ethnic nationalism instead of a critique of racial capitalism. And then what ends up happening is that misunderstanding of ethnic studies as ethnic nationalism opens the door for white nationalists, including Zionists, to push for a conservatizing interpretation of what ethnic studies is. So we're at a moment too where some of you were fighting the fight. Bob, you were fighting the fight for ethnic studies. So many of you were fighting that kind of fight. But right now, when ethnic studies stands because of Newsom to be implemented at the K through 12 level, there's a way in which racial formation is understood in very conservative, static, hypostatized, congealed ways that I don't think was originally intended.
Christine, we're running out of time, right? Are we coming?
We are. I mean, I think, you know, we can end shortly after this. I'm sorry I took up so much time.
I just wanted to add, and this is a complete change of not a complete, but it refers back to another set of considerations. But one branch of Harry's work that we alluded to a couple of times, talking about the Grundrisse and the study groups and what we looked at. But one important branch that I've actually used in my work had to do with the circulation of commodities. And there's a well-known cycle of the circulation of commodities that Harry helped us to understand about production, distribution, I'm trying to remember now, production, distribution, something, and consumption. What was the fourth one? Anyway, it's a terribly important circulation. Okay, it's a terribly important set of distinctions which are non-intuitive as to how you understand what's going on. I inserted it into a discussion about employment and employment discrimination versus consumer protection laws, and got lots of puzzle looks. The work, the framework is important. Stuart Hall uses that same cycle, essentially the four-part cycle, in his work on representation. So it's not as if other people aren't there reading Marx and the Grundrisse and trying to develop and understand it. But I just mentioned it because it's a branch of Harry's work, one of his parts of Harry's work, which may be applicable, could be applied and understood in the context of some of these issues we've been raising about different groups. Where do they fit into in terms of consideration of different classes, different moments in their immigration histories and in their genealogical understanding of their own personal histories. The cycle, that four-part cycle, might offer ways to sort out some of these ideas. And I offer it only to that there's a lot more to Harry's work that we can consider and look at for future reference. So it's that spirit that I threw it out there. Not that I'm trying to offer anything particular, but there's more to Harry's work that we definitely can look at.
And we will have the occasion to be able to see it once the website, the digital archive, is up and functioning. And as Paul and Eric add to that, we'll have the capacity to revisit those works. And I normally I would end very promptly, and I realize that I probably should, although I have I'm not super professional, but I also am mindful of the fact that this feels like a very rare and special reunion of people, in this space. And I want to be able to give Miriam and/or Belvin the last word before I just make an announcement about tomorrow. So I hope you don't mind staying on a little bit late. That's what I meant to say.
Thanks, Christine. Real fast. I think Harry embodied what might be called the working class intellectual, or the organic intellectual. In other words, as the speakers have all said, he provided some kind of a link between intellectual, theoretical, analytical practice and the challenges and struggles of the day. I think the Center for Racial Justice can be an institutional reflection of that type of practice. In other words, taking up issues, theories, fights that need to be taken up and not just absorbed into mainstream, get ahead in the academic world type of situation. So I think Harry, for me, embodied a lot of that, getting that access to intellectual understandings, whether you can even read or write, as being really, really important. And I think some of the discussion around the racial categories and a lot of it is leftists within different communities have to fight for a place to stand and to work and to defend from. So I think part of like dealing with groups monolithic, you have to look at what the left has tried to do within these different communities to get a better sense of what's going on. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you. Well, we're going to end on this note, but I just want to say that, as someone who wasn't of the generation that had a chance to study with Harry, but I've done Huxup with Paul, so there's a kind of trajectory there, and that's how I first heard of Harry. And I think some other people who are, on this call also have heard of Harry, but not had the opportunity to engage deeply, both in terms of the writings and then the writings of people who studied with Harry. So there's this kind of very powerful archive of material, of analysis, of clarifying critique that so many people who are present in the Zoom space have contributed to, as well as the organizing that you've done. And so just thank you so much for joining today. I hope that there's going to be, there's part 1 this morning, there's part 2 this afternoon, and I hope that when Paul and Eric have the archive up, there will be a chance for part 3. But for tomorrow, we have the launch of the Ending the Korean War syllabus project. And this has been a project that's been long in the works. And in the afternoon, there will be a conversation with Juyeon Ri. And some of you may or may not know Juyeon, but she is someone who has been holding down anti-imperialist study sessions for well over a decade, and particularly with regard to a program that is called the Korea Exposure and Education, Education and Exposure Program. And through that, many of us who are on this call had a chance to visit North Korea, South Korea, as well as Japan. And so there will be a conversation about that tomorrow in the afternoon. So we hope that you will join us for the final day. And just thank you everyone so much. Thank you so much to our presenters. Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, all of you who have come to join us today.